What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and in today's video I'm going to be building and testing a $750 gaming PC using Nvidia's brand new RTX 4060. For comparison, I'm also going to be pulling out the 4060 and throwing in AMD's RX 6700 XT into the same system and putting them head to head to see whose $300 graphics card is best right now. I think this will be a particularly interesting video as many reviewers are going to be testing the 4060 with i9s and Ryzen 9s to eliminate all bottlenecks, but this video will give you a more realistic look at the performance you can expect in a budget system with these cards. While Nvidia has been heavily marketing the 4060 line of cards for 1080p, I'm also going to be testing at 1440p to see if 8GB of video memory is enough or if you need 12GB to get solid averages and 1% lows at 1440p. So before I go in depth about each of the cards, let's first talk about all the other parts going into this $750 budget gaming PC. The name of the game for this system is price to performance. Because of this, I went with what I consider the best budget CPU on the market right now, which is the Intel Core i5-12400F. The CPU is currently selling for $150 on most sites, but I'm seeing listings for it as low as $135, which is an incredible value. The 12400F has 6 cores with 12 threads and can boost up to 4.4 GHz. This is kind of the minimum I would pair with the 4060 or 6700 XT, but for gaming on a budget, the CPU really can't be beat in my opinion. One other nice thing about it is it comes with Intel's new stock cooler in the box. It's got a copper slug, an adequately sized aluminum heatsink, and sleek looks. It can get a little noisy depending on your configuration, but because it comes free in the box, it means I was able to save money in this area to use in other parts of the build. For the motherboard, I'm going with my favorite current pairing for a budget 12th gen Intel system, which is the Gigabyte B660M DS3H-AX. For $110, this board is offering 4 DIMM slots, 2 M.2 slots, plenty of PCIe expansion, and decent VRMs. The back panel I/O is pretty solid with the nice inclusion of built-in Wi-Fi, and it uses a nice neutral color scheme that should fit well in most builds. The B760 version of this board is $10 cheaper right now, so I would recommend that one as it's essentially the same board, but newer and has support for Intel 13th gen CPUs out of the box. The reason I went for the B660 version is because I had it on hand. For RAM, I again went with kind of the minimum I would recommend, which is a 2x8GB kit of G.Skill Ripjaw's DDR4 memory at 3600 MHz CL18. This kit's about $40 and offers enough speed and capacity for modern gaming, and the 2 free RAM slots on our motherboard means upgrading to 32GB is as easy as popping in 2 more 8GB sticks in the future. For storage, I went with a 500GB WD Black SN770. This is a super solid budget NVMe SSD, perfect for a boot drive in a system like this one. 500GB is enough for your OS, applications, and a small games library. This will get you up and running with the system, and when you find you need more storage, you can just pop in another NVMe drive into the extra slot. SSD prices are declining at a rapid pace, meaning adding another terabyte of NVMe storage can be done for under $40 and possibly even cheaper in the future. To power the system, I knew I didn't need anything crazy, as this PC should only draw about 350 to 450 watts depending on which card you use. Because of this, I went with the Thermaltake BM2 550. This is a 550 watt 80 plus gold rated unit with a modular design and all black sleeve cables. This was selling for about $60 when I originally parted out this system, but is currently sold out, so as an alternative, I recommend this 600 watt unit from EVGA that's actually a little nicer, but currently sells for about $15 more. 600 watts is more than enough power for this system with either the 4060 or 6700 XT, so either way you go, it should work fine. Finally, for the case, I went with this Gamdias ATX mid-tower unit that currently goes for only $60 on Amazon. It features a tempered glass side panel, a mesh front panel, and 4 120mm ARGB fans, which for only $60 is a pretty darn good deal in my opinion. Building in it was fairly easy and there's decent room for cable management. I could have went slightly cheaper, but this case fits the build and the budget very nicely in my opinion. So now that you've seen all the other parts, let's talk about the two graphics card options we're going to be exploring in this video. Option 1 is the brand new RTX 4060. This is the Asus dual model that features a metal backplate, dual fan design, and a good sized heatsink. This is a good representation of an MSRP 4060 coming in at the $300 price point. It does have ray tracing cores and tensor cores built in, which can be a big plus depending on the type of games and applications you use. With that being said, I'll be mostly focusing on pure rasterization performance, as that's personally what's most important to me. And just know that I'll be discussing more later in the video about these technologies. The most polarizing spec on this card is the fact it's using 8GB of GDDR6 video memory on a 128-bit bus. Nvidia has also implemented a relatively large 24MB of L2 cache to help with this somewhat low amount of memory, but until we actually test it, it's hard to know how much a difference it'll make. Like I said before, I'll be testing both 1080p and 1440p gaming, as to me the $300 price point is where, in my opinion, 1440p gaming should be both possible and expected. One other thing to note is the RTX 4060 is only using an 8x PCIe interface. This shouldn't be a problem on newer boards, but could be a deal breaker if you're wanting to throw this card in an older system. Option 2 is the older but similarly priced AMD RX 6700 XT, which can be had for as little as $310. This MSI Mech OC model I'm featuring here currently sells for about $30 more than an MSRP 4060 and has both some obvious upsides and downsides when compared to the 4060. The big upside is the fact it includes 12GB of video memory, which for high resolution and high texture gaming can be a big advantage. The big downside, in my opinion, is the much higher power draw. This card consumes around 100 watts more than the 4060, which can add up a lot if you live in a place where power is expensive. Beyond this, AMD is infamous for having bad drivers, and this card was originally released 2 years ago, meaning driver updates are going to end far before they do for the 4060. With that being said, we'll see how it stacks up to the 4060, and I'll make a conclusion at the end on whether or not most people should pick one over the other. So now let's talk about testing. I tested 7 games using a mix of AAA and esports titles. I tested most of these games at 1080p and 1440p to see how these cards differ at different resolutions, so let's go ahead and start with the 1080p benchmarks. Starting things off with Borderlands 3 at 1080p ultra settings, I used the built-in benchmark, and doing this resulted in the 6700 XT giving about 8% more average FPS than the 4060 and about 7% higher 1% lows. This is definitely an improvement over the 4060, but as you can see on a system like this, the gap isn't quite as big as it would be with something like a modern i9 CPU. Moving on to Far Cry 6, I test this game at 1080p ultra settings using the built-in benchmark. Doing this resulted in the 6700 XT performing about 11% better in average FPS and about 3% faster in terms of 1% lows. Again, the 6700 XT has a clear advantage in this game. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, which I tested using the built-in benchmark on the high preset. This resulted in the 6700 XT edging out the 4060 in average FPS by about 3% and being about 5% better in the 1% lows. This result again was a little surprising to me, as I expected the gap to be a bit higher. In Horizon Zero Dawn at the ultimate preset using the built-in benchmark, these cards were within 2% of one another for the average FPS, with the 6700 XT having an approximately 4% lead in the 1% lows. In Valorant, the 4060 actually outpaced the 6700 XT by about 6% in average FPS, and even by a fair margin in the 1% lows. Now, I tested each card on multiple maps, but with a multiplayer game like this, getting consistent results can be difficult to do. With that being said, both these cards are averaging above 350 FPS, so effectively the experience is exactly the same. In Rainbow Six at 1080p with the Ultra preset, we basically see the results from the last test flipped, with the 6700 XT outpacing the 4060, but again, both cards are providing well over 300 FPS on average. Finally, in Fortnite, I tested using DX12 with the high preset and ran the same path on both cards a number of times in the Team Rumbles mode. Doing this resulted in the 6700 XT winning out by about 6% in average FPS, and we saw a massive increase in 1% lows of 30%, making the 6700 XT the clear victor in this game. So for 1080p, I was honestly surprised at how closely these two cards perform when paired with a more realistic CPU. The 6700 XT had the clear edge in most games, and it will be interesting to see if the gap widens with 1440p testing. For 1440p, I retested all the games except for Valorant and Fortnite, and just as a note, these screen caps were recorded internally, so the in-game numbers are going to be a little lower than the actual benchmark results presented for both cards. In Borderlands 3 at 1440p ultra settings, the 6700 XT saw about 16% higher average FPS and nearly 18% higher 1% lows, which is a much larger difference when compared to the 1080p results. In Far Cry 6 at 1440p ultra settings, I found the 6700 XT to be about 15% faster than the 4060 in average FPS and nearly 10% faster in 1% lows, which again is a much wider gap than we saw in the 1080p benchmarks. In Cyberpunk at 1440p high preset, we again saw a significant win for the 6700 XT with 10% higher average FPS, but only marginally better 1% lows. I honestly thought the gap was going to be wider in this game, as Cyberpunk is one of those titles people reference a lot when talking about games that you need a lot of VRAM to play. Horizon Zero Dawn saw a small victory of about 6% for the 6700 XT and average FPS at 1440p ultimate quality. There was also a 7.5% increase in the 1% lows over the 4060 as well, which is interesting to see because in 1080p these two cards were pretty much neck and neck. Finally, in Rainbow Six at 1440p ultra quality, the 6700 XT was about 10% faster than the 4060 in average FPS and about 6% faster in 1% lows, which again, when you're talking about 277 versus 252, the experience in a game like this is essentially the same. Overall, it was interesting to see the 6700 XT taking much more dominant lead in the 1440p benchmarks, which is likely due to the higher amount of video memory and the lower CPU load required for 1440p gaming. When paired with a more realistic CPU like the 12400F, gaming at 1080p really doesn't favor the 6700 XT over the 4060 by that much, at least in the titles I tested. Where the 6700 XT really begins to shine over the 4060 is in 1440p gaming, where it had a much clearer victory. This begs the question of whether or not the 6700 XT is truly the superior card when paired with a budget CPU like the 12400F and gaming at 1080p. The main pro is the larger amount of video memory, which may improve things even further in the future. With that being said, this comes at the cost of much higher power draw, worse ray tracing performance, and a higher likelihood of driver problems. This is anecdotal, but during my testing, I experienced game crashes in 4 of the 7 titles when using the 6700 XT versus 0 when using the 4060. This is even after reinstalling the drivers. While this is again anecdotal and is only really a big deal in competitive titles, it's still something I felt like I should mention. Nvidia also has other technologies like frame generation and DLSS that can help close the performance gap between these two cards, but AMD has FSR, which is a similar technology to DLSS, and frame generation is only really ideal in single player games. So what do I think about the 4060? Overall, it's a boring incremental release, but I honestly don't hate it as much as a lot of other people do. I think this card at $250 or even $275 would actually be much easier to recommend, but at its current $300 price, the value just isn't quite there in my opinion, unless you personally value Nvidia's technology super high. This is going to be pretty controversial, but after testing these two cards, if I was building a system like this one for 1080p gaming, I might actually pick the 4060 over the 6700 XT. Don't get me wrong, the 6700 XT is an objectively better card when you look at the FPS numbers, but the higher power draw, shorter window for driver updates, and crashing I experienced made the better performance just not worth it in my opinion. But this also comes down to how I game and use my system. I don't care about the latest and greatest titles running at max settings. I usually play older games and usually at medium settings because they'll look pretty good and give me much better FPS than cranking up all the sliders. I also value stability a lot, and I've personally had a much better experience with Nvidia drivers when compared to AMD. With that being said, I think for a lot of people, the 6700 XT makes more sense, especially when gaming at higher resolutions, settings, or with a more powerful CPU. And beyond that, these aren't your only two options. Now is a great time to pick up a second-hand card for much better price to performance, and that's a route that I would highly recommend. Based on what I heard and read beforehand, I honestly went into this video thinking it was going to be a slam dunk for the 6700 XT, but that's not quite the case in my eyes. Something I also want to make clear is this is just my opinion. Don't just watch my video on the card. There are tons of creators like Hardware Unboxed who are going to have benchmarked the 4060 in way more games and with a much more powerful system to show how much performance you're potentially leaving on the table when compared to a 6700 XT. I'm also interested to hear what you guys think about the 4060 and me testing this card with a more realistic pairing. Do you think this content was valuable, or do you only care about seeing these cards in their best case scenario? So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing, and as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.